go, yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll see you.
Much, Ed. It's so great to be here today and to be able to moderate this panel. There's such a timely discussion. The issues around immigration and migration have had global prominence in recent years, with more refugees in the world since World War II, with political debates in the West centered around immigration, Trump, Brexit, need I say more? And here in Canada, the Advisory Committee on Council on Economic Growth recommended to Minister Morneau that we increase immigration levels by 50% to drive growth in the labor force and promote economic growth. If we look backwards, Canada's formula for economic growth has been a growing labor force, great and abundant natural resources.
Yeah. How are you?
And
good. I'll be back in 1 second.
See, Ed. and productivity growth. But as we look forward, we know that we will be facing a lower birth rate and a rapidly aging population. So in this context, one important question is the role immigration can play in promoting growth in the future. The federal government has a number of initiatives underway in this area to increase immigration and to attract talent to Canada to encourage immigrants to stay. So this year, immigration will be at about 15% higher than historical levels. The Atlantic Pilot Project is going to allow employers to identify and recruit new immigrants and bring them into Atlantic Canada and encourage them to stay and work with those immigrants so that they'll stay and help the economy grow there. And the Global Skills Strategy will be facilitating the recruitment of top talent that drives growth. But the question for our panel today is this enough? Can or should immigration be used further to drive growth? And what are the conditions, equally importantly, that are needed to support successful economic and social immigration of newcomers? So I'm really hoping that our panelists will help us answer these questions. And I'd like to invite them to come up now. We have Jennifer Keesmaat, who's the Chief Planner of the City of Toronto, Tiff Macklem, the Dean of the Rotman School of Management, and Kate Subak, the Executive Director of the Century Initiative.
Thank you, Marta.
Welcome.
Where do you want us here?
I think Marta was going to sit there.
Oh, Marta's going to sit there.
Oh, then I'll go over one, sorry.
There's actually no assigned seating. Oh, these are spinny.
Oh, yeah.
No, okay. Okay, everyone's still and comfortable? Great. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to ask our panelists to each take a crack at a few questions to kick off this discussion. So my first question, and I'll start with Kate on this one, is what is your view? Do we need to make a concerted effort to grow our population?
I'm so glad you asked that. Canada needs more people. We have a historic opportunity. I believe that Canada's brand has never been stronger. People want to come to Canada. But we have work to do. Believe me, I know. Population growth is a tough sell. It's filled with misinformation and polarizing debates. I've found when I talk to people about the topic of immigration that there are 5 issues that are a bit of a slider from threat to opportunity that we keep coming back to. The first is jobs. Do immigrants help create jobs or do they fill jobs? The second one is something we've talked a lot about today, which is Canadian values. The third is how robust is our social safety net? I've heard a lot about national security. And finally, the ability to integrate newcomers to Canada. I believe that to grow, we need smart policy and we need public support. If we don't address these issues, our population will fall because our replacement rate is above the 1.6 fertility rate. Our GDP will fall with it, and the promise of Canada will also fall. At the Century Initiative, we're doing at least 3 things. One is we're modeling Canada's economy along with the help of the Conference Board of Canada. We're gathering data on the impact of immigration, and we're reaching out to both the Canadian public and policymakers by convening conversations, appearing at forums like this, and building a digital platform to assess public sentiment, which I'm excited will hopefully be ready for Canada Day.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Tiff, do you want to jump in on this one?
So your question is, do we need if I got it, do we need a population agenda? And I guess this is a growth summit. The way I would put it is we need a growth agenda, and population, and particularly labor force growth, is one piece of that. If you look back over the last 40 years, up to about 2000, growth was about 3%. Half of that came from labor force growth. The other half came from productivity growth. More workers, more output per worker. Ooh, I've got to watch these chairs.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing now is that as the baby boomer generation moves from workforce to retirement, labor force growth is coming down. It was 1.5, it's now below 1. Unfortunately, in principle, that could be replaced if we could get faster productivity growth. Unfortunately, that's come down too. So now we're getting growth, of about 1.5%. Seems like as good as it gets. So if we've got to, if we want to be a more prosperous society, we've got to get that back up. So immigration is going to be an important part of our labor force growth, but it's not the only part. We have lots of people already here in Canada. And there are opportunities to improve the labor force participation. Take women. We actually have a pretty high rate of labor force participation in Canada, but if you compare us to some Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, with more informed childcare policies, there is potential to increase female participation. We've got all these baby boomers moving into retirement. When the retirement age was set at 65, life expectancy was less than 70. It's now over 80. People are living longer, they're healthier. We need to adjust we need to facilitate working longer in life. We need to make it more flexible. Most of these people don't want full-time jobs, but a lot of them are very interested in further labor force engagement. Aboriginal community, the fastest growing population in Canada. There's long been a moral imperative to improve the labor market participation of Aboriginals. There's now increasingly an economic imperative as well. And then, yes, we have to, I do think it is a moment in time for Canada has an opportunity to attract more of the best global talent, and that's going to be part of the mix. And then the other piece is, that grows labor force participation. The other piece is we have to improve productivity. I mean, ultimately, we have to become a more dynamic, more innovative economy that attracts more of the world's talent and grows the economy. But just bringing more people in isn't going to, by itself, grow the economy.
Well, maybe we'll keep you here for the next panel then, Tiff, on innovation. Jennifer, did you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. Well, I think there's a few different lenses through which you can come at this question, and one is labor. Do we need global talent? Yes. Do we need labor? Yes. Do we need skilled labor? Absolutely. But another way in is really to take the lens, which I think the minister was just talking about, which is about values. And if we actually believe that in Canada, we're doing something very, very special on a global scale in terms of peace, prosperity, our values, living out a truly multicultural society in a world that is increasingly becoming more and more insular. The opportunity to grow as a country is actually about growing a population that really becomes a beacon in the world of those values. And I think that's another lens. Should we grow? Yes, we should grow because we're doing a good thing in the world, because the world needs more Canada, because there are many people in the world today who are being displaced precisely because there are values that are based on inclusion, and we want to build a country based on inclusion. And we're actually doing a pretty good job at that, and we're committed to figuring out how to do it better. So should we grow based on that lens of the values that are underpinning Canadian society? I think that's a whole other way into the question, and I would be surprised if many people would argue, based on that lens, that we should say, no, we're full, we're done. We're wealthy, and we in fact have some really good infrastructure. I'm not talking about physical infrastructure, we'll talk about that in a minute, but in terms of our Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that is a beacon in the world.
Thank you. Okay, let me dive a little bit into, we're going to come back to a number of these issues in the course of this conversation, but let me dive into one issue that Tiff talked about, which is global talent. So my question for you, Tiff, is it about growing the labor force, or is it about attracting the right kinds of people to Canada for the labor force that we need in the future, or is it both?
Well, look, I think as we consider our immigration policy, it only makes sense to have a conversation about the kinds of immigrants Canada needs and are going to help grow our economy. One of the great privileges of being at U of T, one of the great privileges of being the dean of the Rotman School of Management, is I actually see this very up close. And just to give you, a couple numbers, the full-time MBA program at Rotman has 700 students. Roughly half of those are international students coming from 38 different countries around the world. Many of those students will stay in Canada, and they're fabulous immigrants. They have great jobs. They're going to contribute to society. They're also going to attract other family members. So even just by going after top global talent, they're going to bring their brothers and sisters, their parents. So you're going to get a broader distribution right from there. The other thing, just to come back to about this moment in time, one thing we're seeing as President Trump, looks increasingly inward in the United States, Brexit, anti-immigration populism you're seeing in many European countries, the Canada brand has never been better. I mean, my international applications for full-time MBA have been growing the last several years around 10%. They've grown 35% this year. This is a moment in time for Canada to attract some of the best global talent. So yes, I do think we need to focus, and I think there are some things we could do to make it even easier to attract that global talent. I think the initiative that the federal government has taken to create this 2-week visa for specialized talent in high tech is a great step forward. I think, building on that pilot, we should look to broaden that to other areas where there's real scarcity. Take students. As I said, many of the students that come to Rotman and other Canadian universities, many of them stay in Canada and have been an important source of prosperity and growth to this country. Why not? And we have relatively, compared to a number of other countries, you can come to Canada, you can apply for landed immigrant, you get a job, you apply for landed immigrant status, you can stay. We can make it even easier. You get into Rotman, you do a security check, there it is, you've got your landed immigrancy status. So there are some things we could do we were starting from a very good place, and I agree with you. The message of inclusion, of diversity, I was just in India. I mean, people are looking at Canada like they've never looked at it before for exactly that reason. And so we could do more to capitalize on that.
I just want to say that we are seeing the impact of your recruitment efforts in our visa offices abroad as we speak, so get those acceptance letters out quickly. Okay, does anyone else want to jump in on this question?
Well, I'll make a quick comment, which is that as our cities are maturing and really becoming something fundamentally different, they're becoming denser. We have infrastructure projects that we've never had before, the Eglinton Crosstown, 19 kilometers of LRT right in the heart of the city. The biggest risk to being able to build our infrastructure in the future is actually having the expertise to deliver on that infrastructure. And if you look at the team that Metrolinx has assembled that is building out the LRT, it's filled with talent from across the world. There's, every meeting you walk into, you bump into a Brit who worked on transit in the UK. They stopped building their transit program. We're expanding ours. There's a perfect synergy to be bringing that expertise into Canada to deliver on the program. In the absence of that international expertise, there's actually a risk to being able to innovate, because we want to draw talent, best practices, experience from other places in the world. And the extent to which we are open to that and we can expedite that, we can in fact see real tangible deliverables on the ground, like new infrastructure.
So Kate, the Century Initiative's headliner has really been about a total number. Mm-hmm. But what's your view about what underlies that number?
Well, it's so interesting to hear these perspectives, because just for context, I'd like to just say that this year, 300,000 people will come to Canada on a permanent basis. Over 800,000 people will come this year on a temporary basis. Our economy needs more than 1 million people a year to come to Canada in order to thrive. So we need top global talent. We also need families to be reunified. We need students. We need migrant workers. I'd like to tell you a story about a friend of mine that I've had the privilege of meeting in this job. His name's Hassan. He lives in Vancouver, and he started a drone company. This company employs dozens of engineers. Recently, Hassan and his wife gave birth to a baby girl. Hassan's from Pakistan. And his wife would like her parents to come to Canada to help raise their daughter. There's a good chance that her parents won't be able to make it to Canada before their daughter goes to school. I think it's really important to remember that Hassan can go anywhere. His company can go anywhere. And that we have to be very thoughtful about the fact that it's not just talent, it's a mix of immigrants, and that our economy really does need people of all stripes to help us kind of tick along.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, question for you to kick off, Jennifer. Do you think that we already have in place the conditions, whether it be infrastructure, services, or housing, to accommodate growth? Or do we need transition time to be able to prepare ourselves for more population growth if we wanted to head in this direction?
So it's an interesting catch-22 that we face. We need growth. We want to bring people primarily into our cities. And yet the flip side is we have to make sure that when people come, they arrive and they succeed because they have the infrastructure, the housing, the transit, the access to libraries and education that will ensure that they can fully transition into Canadian life and be prosperous as Canadians. So I think we do not have the luxury today of saying, hold on a minute, we've got infrastructure challenges, let's figure those out. Because as the Metrolinx and the transit example demonstrated, the two are actually conjoined. So, I think we have an infrastructure crisis in this country. We see this in the City of Toronto. The provincial government made an announcement today about some measures to temper foreign speculation in our market, but there was an absence of any comment about addressing some of the bigger housing issues around access to affordable housing, about how first-time buyers can get into the market. There's a whole suite of tools and investments and policies that need to be expedited in order to ensure that when people get here, they in fact are going to thrive. And that's our biggest risk. So our biggest risk is we can't say no, and we don't want to say no, but on the flip side, we really have to move into hyperspeed in terms of delivering on the infrastructure that we require. And the challenge that we see in a city like Toronto is that we have been absorbing a tremendous amount of growth. We're one of the fastest growing cities in North America. We're taking 100,000 people into the region on an annual basis. And we've had a really hard time expanding our transit infrastructure. And we know that the transit infrastructure is a critical link for new immigrants being able to access education and jobs. And so we actually begin to isolate people and we compromise their success when they come into a Canadian city if they don't have the access they need to the resources that will allow them to transition into the community and into the middle class ultimately. So there's this incredible risk that we face on the one hand, and I do think that we've been pretty timid. I think the federal government has made some very strong and clear gestures. Creating the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is all about recognizing that infrastructure matters and infrastructure is in fact a national interest. My only concern is we're really back on our heels right now, and we do have a housing crisis in the City of Toronto, as an example. So I don't know how new people are going to come when we're finding that it's very difficult, even for people who've been here for a very long time, to access appropriate and acceptable housing, just as a baseline. And housing and transit are the two linchpins, but the third pillar is really access to education. And one of my very good friends is a school teacher, and every 6 months or so, I'll ask her who she's teaching now because she teaches English as a second language. And, a year ago, all the kids coming in were Roma kids, and now she's got She's got Syrian refugees that she's teaching to speak English. And the role that the education system plays in fully integrating kids into Canadian society cannot be understated as one of our big successes. So housing, transit, and the education system are the three pillars that our success in accommodating growth hinges on.
Kate or Tiff, do you want to jump in on this question of infrastructure or supports?
I'll maybe just one thing, building a bit on Jennifer. One thing we know about immigrants is they're disproportionately attracted to our major cities. And there is increasing evidence now that the gains to what are known as now these superclusters, these really successful cities, are nonlinear. We're seeing the most successful cities in the world become increasingly successful, some less successful cities really, really suffering. So, we've really got to make sure that our major cities in Canada are tremendously successful. And it's really about these benefits of clustering, agglomeration that bring suppliers together with companies and entrepreneurs and research-intensive universities that are providing both research and graduating talent. Also with governments that getting more dialogue between business and government to get more informed regulatory policies. When you get all these things working, you can really get non-linear benefits in terms of growth. But the other side is, to get back to Jennifer, is that when you put all these people in a smaller space, if you don't have the infrastructure, you start to get these diseconomies of scale. You start to get a lot of bottlenecks. And that then, that causes people to leave. So when you think about the GTA, a couple of things. I mean, Silicon Valley, probably the most successful supercluster in the world. We talk about it as Silicon Valley. Well, we've got Waterloo, we've got Toronto. We talk about them as Waterloo and Toronto. It should be a Tech North corridor. And part of that is getting better links, but part of it is just psychology. We think of Silicon Valley as a valley. We don't think of it as San Francisco, Santa Cruz, Palo Alto. We've got to get a bit more of that cluster mentality here.
So a question for Kate to kick off. We have seen in recent election campaigns and referenda the issue of immigration playing a role in quite a negative sense. We don't see that in Canada at the moment. We see quite high and sustained levels of public support for immigration and a sense of confidence that our immigration system is well managed and that lends public confidence to it. Is this a risk factor for us going forward? And if so, how should we address it?
Public support is mission critical. It just plain is. And step one is listening. I think that's why we're trying to build a digital engagement platform to really listen to what young people feel, rural communities feel, Aboriginal Canadians feel, people who were born here, people whose parents were born here, people whose parents weren't born here. But once we've taken that pulse in terms of how people really feel, we can then begin to have a meaningful dialogue. But we've learned, I believe internationally, that listening is absolutely critical to being able to address people's concerns. And they're valid concerns. I'm embarrassed to say that right now the largest online presences in the area of immigration are fivefold. One is the Canadian government process pages, and the others are the Viper, Kelly Leach, and an anti-Muslim Facebook group. We all need to be part of this conversation. It might not be something we can solve tonight, but I'm committed, and I know that many of us feel very strongly that we should keep at it, that participation is really important. Telling us what you think is really important. We're listening. I don't know if that gets at it. But,
Well, I'll add maybe a bit of a counterpoint, which is, we do tons and tons of public consultation in city planning. We consult, we literally have 5 or 6 meetings happening every single night of the week in city planning. We hold lots of large forums and events and roundtables, and we have a Twitter presence. And one of the things that is clearer to me than it ever has been is that we need to be having informed debates and conversations. And I don't actually care about someone's uninformed opinion. I really don't. I'm much more interested in having a conversation about what are our shared values? What is it that we're seeking to achieve? Let's have that conversation. And if we, in fact, are strategic and effective in our consultations, we will shape public opinion. We will change public opinion by bringing facts and data and analysis to the table. For example, if we talk about the success of our immigrants in this country, and we look at the extent to which, and this was kind of funny when Trump was busy slamming the doors and other people were writing articles about, hold on a minute, have you looked at Silicon Valley? It's filled with immigrants, by the way, the most productive part of your entire country. When you begin to add data, we can overcome, I think, some of the thinking that is threatened by our values or threatened by change. And I think that's sort of taking a stake and planting it in the ground and saying, this is who we are, and let's actually build a dialogue about how we can become more of what we are. And I think that's it. So I hear the listening piece. I think the listening needs to be the beginning point before having really robust conversations about our future and who we are and what it is that we value, and having those debates in a very public forum where we can talk about our future. I think that is the backbone to actually building a society where there's a shared sense of purpose and a shared ownership over a vision for the future.
Tiff, did you want to jump in on this one?
I don't have much to add. I will just say that we are doing a better job than many in Canada, but we certainly can't be complacent, and we can't take it for granted. If you look at things like Elderman's trust surveys, you can see that the trends in Canada are not completely different than the trends in other countries. We're starting from a better place, and we're in a better place. So we can't be complacent. And I agree with both speakers. But we've got to bring evidence-based analysis to this. The question about what are the impacts of immigrants on economies, that's something that there is lots of evidence-based economic analysis on in Canada, in other countries. And what comes through consistently is when levels of you look at immigration, it doesn't depress wages. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Yes, immigrants are new workers, but they're also new consumers. They're new contributors to society. And particularly if you're getting the kind of immigrants that the country needs, it's a pretty balanced scorecard there. And a lot of the fears that people have are actually not materializing.
So we're getting a lot of good questions in on Slido, but before we open it up and answer some of your questions, I'd like to turn the mic over for a minute to my minister, Minister Ahmed Hussein, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. Welcome, Minister, to give a few thoughts about what he's heard so far from the panel today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marta, for that kind introduction. I would like to indicate that I've really enjoyed your input. I was at the Century Initiative meeting that you organized for me a number of weeks ago, and found out that Century Initiative is more than the $100 million figure, the 100 million people figure. Quite interesting. Number of things that came to my mind. Really important to talk about. Not just having more skilled immigration, but also to have a serious conversation about productivity and the threat of reducing productivity and having an ambitious plan to bring it back or even increasing it to where it was. My question has to do with, and this is a question that has been top of my mind, is how do you move messaging away from the facts are there, the figures are there that you said, but how do you move messaging away from immigrants taking jobs versus immigrants creating jobs? And then the second question is immigrants sort of using up our scarce benefit system versus actually immigrants bringing the productivity and the prosperity to shore up those threatened and eroding benefit systems that we all enjoy in Canada. So the facts show that, yes, immigrants actually create more jobs for all of us. and that, in fact, the prosperity that they create also shores up our benefit system. So we all know that in this room. The point is, how do you get that across in a concise and convincing manner to those people on the outside? That's my question.
Who wants to go first?
Well, first, I can't help but echo what you're saying, Minister Hussain. I think it's really important, first of all, to do the analysis and then come to a thoughtful conclusion. And you're right on both fronts, not surprisingly. The data is clear. The job-stealing immigrant is a myth. We know that new arrivals start more companies than people that are born in Canada. According to Adam Davidson, the benefits of immigration may be the most settled fact in economics. Immigrants create jobs, jobs create opportunities. I can do the same thing in terms of healthcare, which is that we know for a fact that people that come to Canada are more healthy than people that are born here. For the first 10 years they are here, on every single health dimension except for one very small category. Heart, stroke, trips and falls, accidental death, mental health outcomes. The only small category is gunshot-related fatalities. But that is based on 100% of Ontarians' health records. So the first, how do we get these messages out? I think the first thing that we need to do is to be very thoughtful in terms of how do we gather that data and how do we come to a sober assessment of what that means. So we know that immigrants are healthier than Canadians. Well, we at the Century Initiative worked to size what that meant. So just from the point of view of adding up the impact of that on provincial healthcare spending, that's $21.5 billion of savings in the next 5 years. And that's enough to pay for a lot of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We need to get these messages out, and I share everybody's concerns. And so that's why, from our point of view, we're returning to first principles, which is first listening very carefully. Mm-hmm. That's why I was talking about those issues. I wasn't. Those are very thoughtful, reasoned positions. We've asked people, and we need to meet them where they are. And so I don't want to talk to them about bills or what have you, but if people care about jobs and they care about values and they care about safety, I do want to be able to talk to them about the fact that immigrants create jobs, that immigrants actually help our health pool by making it a better insurance. Oh, okay, don't let me start on insurance, but in any event, they reduce provincial spending on health. And so from my point of view, it's a bit of a return to first principles. First, listen. Second, gather the facts. And third, we're going to be out there talking as loudly as we can to as many people that will listen, both in person and online.
Tiff, you've had many jobs over your career where you've tried to get out complicated economic facts to the public. What advice do you have? Yeah, well, I wasn't going to mention that.
Well, I haven't always succeeded, but I guess I would add two things. I agree absolutely. It starts with just really good evidence-based analysis and boiling that down and simplifying it and getting some brilliant communicators who can put that in something punchy and get it out there. But two other ideas, and one of them you already used, Kate. The other one is to tell stories. Stories of people who've come to Canada and have been instrumental in building this country. People relate to stories, so we should all have a few of those stories, and we should tell them. And then my other suggestion, Minister, is also connecting immigration to other parts of the government's agenda. So I mean, take trade. Okay, Canada, 75% of our trade is the United States. It's been a great run, but it's not, in the last 10 years, it's not been the run that it used to be. And going forward, the center of economic gravity has shifted increasingly to Asia. We are very under-leveraged to Asia. Well, how do you actually build trade relationships? It actually comes down to people. It's people who, are comfortable doing business with each other. And, just to come back to my sort of on-the-ground experience. So, I've got all these students that come to Rotman. Many of them stay in Canada, but some of them go home. And actually, the ones that go home, that's a big benefit to Canada too, because they stay in touch with Canadians. They often start Canada-India businesses, Canada-China businesses, Canada-Vietnam businesses, Canada-Korea businesses, Canada, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico. And so those are, this becomes a strategic asset for Canada. It's a strategic asset for business in Canada. And so, that's something I think that will, as people see this as a strategic asset, that's something that is very, aligns with your agenda and helps build the country.
Jennifer, you want to get in?
Well, I'll just say that I think this is very much a communication challenge in light of a global dialogue that's actually going in the other direction. Like if you look at the narrative coming out of other large G7 countries, whether it's Australia or America or London or England, so we're actually going against a very, very big tide in trying to shift a narrative. And I completely agree that telling stories is really critical. But I do think the most important and powerful thing is to be using data and to be using what we know. You said, we know this, it's factual. One of the challenges that we have is a moment in history where you can say something that's factual and people look at you and they say exactly the opposite. And it's almost like you're having a conversation, but of course you're not. It's the most bizarre thing. It's a very strange moment that we face. But I think if we can take a page from what might seem, and it is sort of an unrelated example, but it's a page from the book that I know very well, which is if we look at the city of Toronto and what happened around bike lanes. And bike lanes are, to your point about linking in with different objectives, bike lanes are about our carbon footprint. They're about environmental sustainability. Bike lanes are about health. We've got lots of data on the implication of active transportation and decreases in health costs. That data exists, it's global, we've got all of that data. We've got the data now, which we didn't have 5 years ago. We've got excellent data on the relationship between bike lanes and local economic development. And in our conversations with the BIAs, and this is why I say so much more is needed than listening, because if you show up at a BIA and say, tell us whether you like bike lanes or not, they're all going to say, we hate bike lanes, they're bad for our business. So on Eglinton, when we were redesigning the corridor, 7 different BIAs, it's 19 kilometers, we went to the BIAs and we listened, and then we went away to U of T, and we, in fact, contracted with U of T to do some data collection and analysis along the corridor. And they worked with the leaders of the BIA, and they discovered something which now I've seen studies from all over the world that have reaffirmed this. It's the same in Toronto as it is everywhere else, that the business owners in Main Street overestimate the number of people that arrive by car, and they underestimate the number of people that arrive on foot and on bike. And it's a significant number. And once we had that data, we were able to go back to the BIA and say, look at this. People who arrive on bike, they spend less each time they arrive, but they come by 5 times more on a monthly basis. So on a monthly basis, they're actually spending significantly more if they're arriving by bike or they're walking. And you know what? That was it. Once the BIA started to see that data, and they have to believe in the data, right? You have to have a credible, which is why we went to a third party. We went to the university because we wanted it to come from an uninterested party. We were advocating for the cycling lanes as being good city building. Once the BIA saw that, it changed the conversation on a dime because they were like, oh, and you got this from our clientele. This is amazing. So I think that a really big part of shaping the narrative is ensuring not only that we have really great data and sometimes a different way in to the question, but then also being relentless. Like on the cycling piece, we've had to be relentless on a whole variety of different perspectives. The health perspective, economic development, safety. Our streets are safety, both for drivers and pedestrians when we have cycling lanes. And collecting data in all those different various areas, and then advancing the narrative was a way of building a broad coalition. All of a sudden, we have people in public health saying, hey, we want bike lanes. Just as we've got bike couriers saying, hey, we want bike lanes, because there's a shared interest that's been established. And I think the shared interest on immigration is so clear, but I don't think we've yet built that broad coalition of interests that are all speaking to the role of immigration in advancing our society. And I think that work still needs to be done. And I think once we do that, it really is about communicating.
Can I'm sorry, I won't
We'll give you one.
on another
We'll give you one.
question.
We'll give you a two-hand.
Okay, a real quick one, which is I'm so struck by this notion of telling stories and shared interests. So you guys might have figured out that I like numbers. And we talked about the million people coming, more than a million people coming to Canada every year. Well, refugees are 25 to 50,000 people. That's a drop in the bucket of the number of people that come to Canada. But that, I personally believe that's what shapes attachment, stories, and public opinion. I'm part of a very large group that has sponsored a family, and my daughter and I went out to visit them a couple months ago. My daughter is 16. She cares a lot about how many people like her. She's a very typical 16-year-old. And our family also has a 16-year-old, and they're wonderful together. They're very embarrassed about their parents. They wear the same leggings, and they roll their eyes a lot. So we asked the daughter and the family, with the help of an interpreter, a number of questions. And at the very end, my daughter Anna said to Rania, what's your hope? What's your dream for being in Canada? And Rania, who had been speaking Arabic the whole time, turned around to Anna and said, I want to be a dentist. And I said, hell yeah, you're going to be a dentist, right? You're 16, you're a teenager, how wonderful is that? I believe that people attach to refugees in a very strong way. And that I know it's been, well, you know more than I do, how difficult it is to administer a program like that. But I think we should acknowledge the role that it plays, both in terms of the stories and in terms of public opinion and in terms of personal attachment.
So this is a great segue into taking some of your questions. And it's a great segue because one of the things that we found in the Syrian Refugee Initiative was that there was great enthusiasm from small towns and rural communities to bring Syrian refugee families into their communities. And the government, working with our partners, made a huge effort to make that happen because normally we tend to destine towards larger urban centers just because of the kinds of resources that are there and family ties and all kinds of other factors. And one of the questions we're getting from the audience right now, the most popular one has been fighting for back and forth for number one and number two, is what about rural Canada? How can we encourage immigration, skilled workers, and innovation into rural communities? And I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm an urbanist, so this isn't my question. But
Fair enough.
I will just say what I see as an overlooked opportunity in the Canadian context is, in fact, our mid-sized Canadian cities. We have, cities like Regina at, tipping around maybe 300,000, or Saskatoon, mid-sized Canadian cities that have a tremendous amount of community capital, that have really a lot of assets in terms of the schools and the parks and the infrastructure that exists. And those cities, in fact, need density and need more people to become more urban so that they can move towards a more sustainable model where they do in fact have Main Street retail and walkable neighborhoods that don't exist today. So the existing road infrastructure, the existing neighborhoods need to be densified. I'm not talking about continuing to sprawl out. So I think there's an incredible opportunity to begin thinking about mid-sized Canadian cities as accommodating a much more significant amount of our growth in the future. And it really needs a strategic look. It needs a strategic plan, drawing on the assets that already exists in those communities. And I'm not completely speaking out of school. I did a lot of work in Saskatchewan before I became the chief planner and worked on a plan around how you make a denser urban core and a more urban place so that young people will stay in places like Regina instead of feeling like they need to come to places like Toronto where there's the innovation and the opportunity. So I think really focusing on mid-sized cities is an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I'll just say there are some examples in Canada of places that are doing a better job. I think Manitoba is a province, actually, that is doing a pretty good job here, and I think the rest of the country should look at what's going on in Manitoba. And also, look, we're a free country. If somebody comes in and starts in one town and wants to move to another one, you know what? We're a free country. That's a great thing. And I don't think we should overly beat ourselves up about that. They're staying in Canada. They're being successful. Yes, you're going to see some mobility. It's not necessarily bad.
Kate, did you want to talk to this one?
It's a conundrum. I've thought a lot about rural Canada, and in the sense that I really believe that a bigger Canada benefits all of us. But I believe that just like people who are born here, immigrants need to have the economic opportunities to attach to a given community and stay there. And that our challenge is to be thoughtful about what that might look like. Now, I don't know, Tiff, you can help me here. I have intuition about something, which is that you don't just get students from, say, China, but you might have pockets of communities in China where students come to Rotman. Is that true?
Well, obviously, countries like China and India, they're huge countries. I mean, there's some dispersion, but yes, they tend to be a little more concentrated because once students start coming, they tell their friends, and their friends are where they were living. So yes, you do get higher concentrations. But the other thing we're seeing last year I had 34 different countries in the Rotman MBA program. This year I have 38 different countries, and I'm pretty sure when I'm on this panel next year, if you invite me back, it'll be over 40. And I think that is also another healthy dimension. It's the interest is broadening, and it's not just broadening by country; it's broadening by background and by sector. So that really sort of speaks to the Canada brand.
And the other thing, I would, back to the question of mix, I lived for a long time in Canada in a very rural community that really had challenges with migrant labor in the sense that we couldn't get the same crews back year after year. They didn't come with health benefits. And so from their point of view, a refugee or somebody who is coming that can stay in Canada is just so welcome. And it's really only the crew chief that needs to speak English, to be perfectly honest, and it's a different set of skills. So there are, and the other thing in the area where I lived was we couldn't get enough trades, particularly stonemasons. And so, that's another opportunity to be thoughtful about an overall mix. We may or may not be able to establish a tech sector presence in every rural community, but there are multiple demands that reflect the local economy.
So the next question has really been, I think, a perennial one here in Canada, and there are a lot of stories that we've all heard about this. But if we're going to attract more skilled people, how can we have more efficient mechanisms for recognizing the qualifications that they come from where they are from?
Well, there's no simple answer to that question. To a lot of degree, it's just really hard work. I mean, we even have that problem within Canada. Recognizing an electrician in one province versus the other. We've got to do a better job within Canada. We've got to do a better job between countries. And, to some extent, I look to you and your provincial counterparts to set up the hard work. The other thing, though, we also, one thing I see is there are programs that really help immigrants, get settled, get integrated, figure out, how to do an interview here in Canada, figure out how the labor market works. We actually run some of these at Rotman. We ran one actually. Was concentrated on immigrant women to help them. These are women with real skilled credentials, but were coming to Canada and having trouble figuring out the labor market. We ran one for the women, and the men got really jealous. This program was so good, so then we've created another one now for immigrant men. These things, there's no question, these kinds of programs can really accelerate, and that program is partly funded by the government. They pay us to run that program.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? No. Okay. Well, there's another sort of bundle of questions about sort of the balance between recruiting top talent here to Canada to help fuel economic growth and prosperity here, and recruiting the top talent that's needed in the countries that people are coming from. How do we strike the right balance there?
I'm happy to start on that one because I have that own conundrum. So, I go out around the world to countries and I tell them I want the best students in the world to come to the University of Toronto. And to be honest, in some ways, it'd be great if they all came and they all settled here and grew the country, but it doesn't feel quite right. As I was saying before, it's the minister's question, actually having some of them go back, first of all, it feels better. It feels like there's a two-way flow. We've benefited. They're going to benefit. Their country's going to benefit. It's win-win. And then the other thing, as I was mentioning, this builds trade relationships. This builds, getting back to the previous session with Minister Freeland. I mean, this builds international relationships, geopolitical relationships. That's how Canada has influence in the world. So, we need a healthy two-way flow. People going home, there's a benefit too.
I just have to say I love the irony of this question because not that many years ago we were having a big conversation about the brain drain, that all of our best talent was leaving the country. Now we're saying, oh no, we might be stealing too much talent. So I think there's a lovely irony to that. I have no idea what the answer is. I know that when I'm hiring people and I'm doing a global search, I want the brightest and the best from wherever they are in the world because I'm sort of self-interested and I'm trying to create a great team and deliver the best product in the city of Toronto. And I'm not going to say, no, you stay where you are in your post. And I'm concerned about delivering what I'm trying to deliver in the Toronto context. So I think it's a very tricky question because in some ways it's a question about, well, how can we take care of ourselves and take care of the whole world too? And I think right now we are sort of saying, well, we have needs. And as a country, we're trying to address those needs. And unfortunately, there might be some unintended consequences for other countries. And because we're Canadians, we'll feel bad about that. Do you think American feels bad about it when they recruit great talent from elsewhere? I don't think so. But I think it's a very tricky kind of challenge.
Kate, do you want the last word?
I would love the last word. I think that migration is a more complicated issue than us being able to have a material impact on another economy by borrowing some talent. And I also feel, as I age, that people often go home. And I feel really wonderfully about having had multiple perspectives and the ability to go home. And so I don't feel that we are necessarily crippling other economies by inviting people to come to Canada. I think what we are instead doing is inviting them to enjoy the promise of what Canada has, and that's a pretty exciting promise. So come on.
Welcome. So that's a great last word. Thank you so much for all of your questions, and thanks to our three panelists for their insights.
So I love the last phrase, so come on. That's good. Look, Jennifer and Tiff, Kate, Marta, I want to thank you so much, both for participating, but also, each of these sessions I'm learning more and more, being more informed, and I'm sure so was the group. I've got to say, up until Jennifer said this a couple minutes ago, and Kate knows this, I think of infrastructure as one of the great impediments to growth because we don't plan well, but I also see that lack of having the people who can do it is the reverse impediment too. I learned about diseconomies of scale, which was great, and about data and storytelling. And I would just say about data and storytelling that the best storytelling, of course, is a blend of anecdote and analysis. It has them both. So thank you very much for your contributions to that panel. Now, we are going to turn to a further subject of innovation. I think actually Canada's ability to bring in immigrants and refugees and absorb generation after generation is part of our innovative contribution to the world. Now we're going to have a conversation with Tom Jenkins, a man of many contributions to Canada and to the world, who has recently co-authored a book with His Excellency Governor General David Johnston called Ingenious: How Canadian Innovators Made the World. And it's a fun book. I'm just going to say it's a fun book. And I don't know, Tom has brought his props with him, I see, that Julie's delivering. So it's apparently going to be a fun discussion. I say it's a public discussion, a public conversation, I guess, because Tom and I share the habit of an aversion to going to sleep at night when we should. And so sometimes we get the opportunity to have these really extraordinary late night phone chats that go on and on, where we sort of egg each other on a little bit. Tom a little bit more than me, but there we go. Tom's the chair of the board of Open Text Corporation of Waterloo, the largest software company in Canada, and one that was involved with a $1.6 billion acquisition last year. He's also the chair of the National Research Council of Canada, chancellor of the University of Waterloo, and I'm not going to go into everything because it would go on and on for a very long time. As I say, the book is called Ingenious: How Canadian Inventors Made the World Smarter, Kinder, Safer, Healthier, Wealthier, and Happier. That's a pretty good combination. And it includes the makers here in Canada of things that surprise me: the dump truck, the paint roller, the jolly jumper, and even, and I don't think we can manage them on these seats, the whoopee cushion. So with that, please, Tom, come join me up here. Thank you.